Frank Abagnale got caught multiple times, escaped multiple times, and in between he successfully impersonated an airline pilot, a doctor, a lawyer, and a university professor, all before his 21st birthday. This is the story of Frank William Abagnale Jr., the greatest con man who ever lived, the man who made the FBI look completely helpless for 5 years, and the man whose story was so extraordinary that Hollywood turned it into one of the most celebrated films ever made. To understand Frank Abagnale, you have to understand where his story begins. Because unlike most of the criminals on this channel, Frank Abagnale did not come from poverty. He did not come from violence. He did not come from a world where crime was the only option. He came from a comfortable middle-class family in Bronxville, New York. His father, Frank Sr., was a successful businessman who adored his son. His mother, Paulette, was a French woman his father had met after the Second World War. They had 4 children. Frank Jr. was one of them. By all accounts, Frank Jr. had a happy childhood. He was intelligent, he was charming, he had a natural gift for talking to people, for reading them, for understanding what they wanted to hear and for giving it to them. From a very young age, he had the kind of presence that made people trust him instinctively. He also had something else, something that would define his entire career. He looked older than he was, much older. As a teenager, Frank Abagnale could pass for a man in his late 20s or early 30s without any effort at all. Combined with his natural charm and his gift for improvisation, this made him extraordinarily dangerous. His parents divorced when he was 12 years old. It was a devastating blow. Frank Jr. adored both his parents, and the collapse of their marriage affected him deeply. When a judge asked him which parent he wanted to live with, Frank reportedly ran out of the courtroom rather than choose. He went to live with his father, but the stability of his childhood was gone. And at 16 years old, Frank Abagnale Jr. ran away from home. He had very little money. He had no qualifications. He had no plan. What he had was charm, a face that looked 10 years older than it was, and an absolute refusal to accept that the world was not going to give him what he wanted. His first cons were small. He discovered that by changing the occupation listed on his bank account, he could extend his overdraft. He experimented with small frauds. He learned quickly what worked and what didn't. And he developed a philosophy that would guide everything he did. Most people believe what they are told by someone who looks and sounds like they know what they are doing. He was about to test that philosophy on a scale that nobody had ever attempted before. Frank Abagnale's first great impersonation was as a Pan-American World Airways pilot. The story of how this happened is almost comically simple. Abagnale called Pan Am's uniform supplier, claiming to be a pilot whose uniform had been lost by a dry cleaner, and asking where he could get a replacement. He was told exactly where to go. He went there, he got a uniform, he walked out looking like a Pan Am first officer. Then he called Pan Am's personnel department, claiming to be a new pilot who had lost his employee identification. He was talked through the process of getting a replacement. He followed the process. He got the ID. He was now, to all appearances, a Pan Am first officer named Frank Williams. He was 16 years old. What happened next is the part that still seems almost impossible. Abagnale discovered that airline pilots traveling between assignments could fly free on any airline by claiming what was called deadhead status, essentially traveling as a passenger while technically on duty. He began using this system to fly around the United States and eventually around the world completely free of charge. He was not flying the planes. He was sitting in the cockpit jump seat or in first class looking the part and talking the talk. And nobody questioned him because he looked like a pilot. He sounded like a pilot. He carried himself like a pilot. Over the course of roughly 2 years, he flew over 1 million miles on Pan Am and other airlines, without paying a single fare. He stayed in hotels by telling them to bill Pan Am. He ate in restaurants and signed the bills to his airline account. He lived an extraordinarily comfortable life that cost him almost nothing. But living costs money, and Abagnale needed income. He developed a second stream of revenue that was even more audacious than his pilot impersonation. He began printing his own checks. In the early 1960s, check fraud was much easier than it is today. There were no computer databases linking banks. Verification was slow and manual, and a confident, well-dressed young man who looked like a successful professional could walk into almost any bank and cash a check without serious scrutiny. Abagnale studied how checks worked. He learned about the magnetic ink character recognition codes, the MICR codes, printed at the bottom of checks that routed them to the correct bank. He discovered that by printing his own account number in magnetic ink in the deposit slot on bank deposit forms, the little slips that bank customers filled out and left in boxes in the lobby, he could redirect other people's deposits into his own account. He did this across multiple states. He printed his number on thousands of deposit slips and quietly replaced the legitimate slips in bank lobbies across the country. The money flowed in. By his own account, he cashed fraudulent checks worth over $2.5 million during his career. In today's money, that is somewhere between $20 and $25 million. The FBI opened a file on him, but catching him was extraordinarily difficult. He was constantly moving. He used multiple identities. He changed his appearance, and he had no fixed address, no regular associates, and no pattern that was easy to track. So he moved on to his next impersonation. In the mid-1960s, Frank Abagnale decided to become a doctor. He moved to Georgia and obtained a fake Harvard Medical School degree, created with equipment he had access to through his various fraudulent activities. He applied for a position as a resident doctor at a hospital in Georgia under the name Frank Connors. He was hired. He was not a doctor. He had never been to medical school. He had no medical training whatsoever. He was a 20-year-old con man from New York. He supervised real medical staff for nearly a year. He read medical textbooks obsessively to stay ahead. He delegated complex medical decisions to the qualified staff around him while presenting himself as the authoritative presence overseeing their work. He was charming. He was confident. He looked the part. He left Georgia before he was discovered. A near miss had made him nervous, and moved on. Next came law. Abagnale obtained a fake law degree from Harvard and passed the Louisiana bar examination. On his third attempt, the first two times he failed legitimately, without cheating. He simply studied and retook the exam until he passed it on his own merits. He worked as a lawyer in the Louisiana Attorney General's office for nearly a year before a colleague who had actually attended Harvard Law School began asking questions that Abagnale could not convincingly answer. He resigned and disappeared before anything could be confirmed. Then he became a university professor. At Brigham Young University in Utah, he taught sociology for a semester under a false identity with a fake transcript showing academic credentials he did not possess. By his own account, this was one of the easier impersonations. He simply stayed one chapter ahead of his students in the textbook and relied on his natural ability to present information confidently. Throughout all of this, the FBI was getting closer. The scale of his check fraud had made him one of the most wanted forgers in the United States. His file had grown enormously. Agents across multiple states were coordinating their pursuit. He was caught for the first time in France in 1969. A former Pan Am flight attendant recognized him from a wanted poster and alerted the French police. He was arrested in the town of Montpellier. He was tried in France and sentenced to a year in a French prison. The conditions were appalling. The French prison of that era was not a comfortable place. He described the experience as the most physically brutal of his life. After serving his French sentence, he was extradited to Sweden, where he served additional time. Then he was extradited to the United States, where he faced federal charges for check fraud. He was sentenced to 12 years in a federal prison in the United States. He served less than 5. In 1974, the United States federal government made Frank Abagnale an offer. He would be released from prison on the condition that he helped the federal government, specifically the FBI and various financial institutions, understand how he had committed his frauds so that they could improve their security and prevention systems. He accepted, and in one of the most extraordinary career transitions in American history, Frank Abagnale went from being one of the FBI's most wanted criminals to being a consultant for the FBI. He spent decades working with the federal government, with banks, with corporations, and with law enforcement agencies around the world, teaching them how con artists think, how fraud is committed, and how to prevent it. He became one of the world's leading experts on fraud and forgery, because he had been one of the world's greatest practitioners of both. He wrote a memoir. He gave lectures. He built a legitimate career that made him genuinely wealthy. And then Steven Spielberg made a movie about him. Catch Me If You Can was released in 2002, starring Leonardo DiCaprio as Frank Abagnale and Tom Hanks as the FBI agent pursuing him. It was one of the most successful films of that year. It introduced Frank Abagnale's story to a new generation of people who had never heard of him. There is one more element to Frank Abagnale's story that is worth discussing, because in recent years serious questions have been raised about how much of it is actually true. Investigative journalists and researchers have examined the claims in his memoir and in his public statements very carefully, and what they have found is that many of the most extraordinary details of his story cannot be verified, and that some of them appear to be contradicted by documentary evidence. Records suggest he may have spent much of the period he claims to have been impersonating pilots and doctors actually in prison for relatively minor offenses. Former Pan Am employees have said they have no record of someone matching his description working as a fraudulent employee. Researchers have found no evidence of him working as a doctor in Georgia or as a lawyer in Louisiana. Abagnale himself has responded to these questions. He acknowledges that some details may be inaccurate. He maintains that the core of his story is true. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. He was certainly a con artist. He certainly committed check fraud on a significant scale. He certainly worked with the FBI after his release from prison. But the specific details, the pilot impersonation, the doctor, the lawyer, the professor, may be as much a con as everything else he ever did. Which in a strange way makes Frank Abagnale even more extraordinary. Because if the biggest con he ever pulled was convincing the entire world that he was the greatest con man who ever lived, then he really was the greatest con man who ever lived. Frank William Abagnale Jr., the pilot who never flew a plane, the doctor who never treated a patient, the lawyer who passed the bar on his third try, the con man who conned everyone, possibly including you.